So the topic for my presentation is titled "The Book of the Covenant in Relation to Other Old Testament legal codes, Their Cultural and Historical Context." The Book of the Covenant is that which we refer to as the laws that were given immediately following the Ten Commandments after Israel's encampment at Sinai. Traditionally, the section we refer to as the Book of the Covenant goes from chapter 20, verse 22, to Exodus 23, verse 33. The title for the Book of the Covenant comes from a phrase in chapter 24, verse 7, when Moses reads aloud the Sefer HaBerit to the people, which means the Book of the Covenant. A brief response as to why the Book of the Covenant is addressed separately from the Ten Commandments. As we noted earlier in previous classes, the Ten Commandments are a certain type of command called traditionally the apodictic command, where it's a simple, here's what you do. These do not have specifically laid out consequences for if you do not do the command, although in a biblical context we can kind of figure it out if God's giving the command. As per a lot of legal systems, you tend to have conflicts that need to get resolved, and so you need to have specific situations for judges and those deciding punishment to look at to decide what the punishment for a specific breaking of a certain law will be. This is where we get into the Book of the Covenant. It's simultaneously it's more specific than the Ten Commandments. It's in a type of law called casuistic law, which is conditional commands. So as we see in chapters 21, 22, and 23, there are plenty, it's almost completely if-then statements. In both the biblical commentary and legal commentary sources that I've read, they all seem to agree that the Book of the Covenant is in itself a commentary on the simple list of 10 apodictic commands found in the Ten Commandments. We kind of see a little bit of foreshadowing of how maybe later on in Israel the Pharisees come up with these 613 commands and have misinterpreted the expansion upon the commandments that we see in the Book of the Covenant. There are several different opinions on what exactly the structure of the Book of the Covenant is. So beginning with the first theory I found is a four-part theory, which actually weirdly doesn't cover everything, but I listed it because I found it in a couple sources. So the first structure, or the first bullet point that is covered then is chapter 21, verses 1 through 11, in which slaves and indentured servants are covered. Specifically the duties that a slave has to his master, and the time limits and options on the length of service, and how a slave's family is given rights. So you have chapter 21, verse 2, when you talk about buying a Hebrew slave, he serves for 6 years, and in the 7th he is free, at no cost to him. If he comes in single, he shall go out single. If he comes in married, his wife will go out with him. However, if his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children actually belong to the master and not to the slave, and the slave is then only released without his biological family at the end of the time period. When a man sells his daughter as a slave, she shall not go out as the male slaves do. If he does not do there are certain protections guaranteed to the female slaves and slave wives in verse 10, when it says, if he takes another wife, he shall not diminish the original wife's food, her clothing, or her marital rights. And if he does not do these three things, then she is then able to go free but she doesn't get any money for it. The next section listed by that same scholar was commercial restitution laws, chapter 21 verses 18 through chapter 22 verse 15. This is where we get into having to define the lex talionis, which will come into key importance later. So it's the law of the tooth, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth sort of thing. Think about the Sermon of the Mount. So basically what this is upon a first reading, it might seem as though there are specific consequences to each sin, but rather it's a ceiling or a limit of punishment to where that is the maximum punishment possible, sort of how today we have a maximum of a certain amount of years in prison or something like that for different offenses. One example, the purpose of all this is to make restitution or make whole the party that was on the victim end of the offense. The victims had, it seems from research, quite a bit of say in what would happen. So the offender is brought before the judge, and so as the victim, the judge said, here's what your maximum payout can possibly be, whether it be death, some sort of fine, some sort of replacement, and then the victim or the group of victims or whatever would be able to say, we want this much, we want the full amount, or we could even just forgive him. So for example, in verse 33 of chapter 21, when a man opens a pit, or when a man digs a pit and does not cover it, and an ox or a donkey falls into it, the owner of the pit shall make restoration. He shall give money to its owner, and the dead beast shall be his. So here we have, if your donkey was walking around, fell into this pit, and then the judge, you could either have the donkey fully paid for, or you could just say, well, I didn't really need it anyway, don't worry about paying me back. But it would be almost completely up to the victim. The next section is Exodus 22, 21 through 27, and 23, verses 10 through 11, in which productive opportunities for the poor are outlined. There has been some debate around some of the grammar in this section, well, vocabulary specifically. When it's talking about lending money to anybody who is poor, you shall be like a moneylender. You shall not be like a moneylender to him, and you shall not exact interest from him. And it's been argued about whether or not that interest is talking about any interest at all or just an unfair type of interest, and there has not been a whole lot of agreement. Other than that, it's kind of one of the smaller later sections for this outline. The next outline is broken up into 4 sections, although it's kind of more just 2 sections, as 1 and 2 pretty much go together and 3 and 4 pretty much go together. So the first section is 21, 2 through 6, 7 through 11, 12 through 17, and 18 through 27. Section 2 is 21, 20 through 32. And then section 3 and 4 are where they take kind of a turn, which will be discussed here in a second. So that's 21 verses 33 through 36, 21 verses 37 through 22 verse 3, and so on and so forth. The thing about these is that sections 1 and 2, the objects of the law are people. And, well, the objects of the law, yeah, they're people, and then sections 3 and 4, the object of the law is property. Once again, this one's kind of a little sketchy as well, and it doesn't really work completely in my opinion. To cover the grammar here really quickly, the casuistic law that makes up the Book of the Covenant is an if-then system. So the protasis of each clause, which is often in English translated as when, is signaled by the Hebrew word ki. So when you have verse 21 verse 2 starts out, when you buy a Hebrew servant, it begins and says, key, and then the following subordinate clauses under the key are signified by eam. Here's some examples. So when you buy a Hebrew slave, if he comes in single, then. If he blanks, then. The key of verse 2 is followed by 4 separate eam clauses, creating a big if-when heading key with the various consequences being signaled by the eam. There's an example in English. When you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall go out for 6 years. Verse 3, if he comes alone, he shall go out alone. If he is the husband of a wife, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master gives him wife. All of these ifs, all of these eam statements are still referring to the purchase of the original Hebrew slave. There are 4 exceptions to the rule. Chapter 21, verses 12, 15, 16, and 17. Verse 12, they're all very short ones. They're kind of like those very short commandments that we had right in the middle of the commandments. And now into the interesting part of the presentation. The other comparable legal codes of the day, the biggest one is really the Code of Hammurabi, which is dated to around 1750 BC. It has 282 laws in total, all of which are similar in the if-then structure and considered to be the oldest lex talionis example. There's a picture of that was discovered somewhat recently, I believe, around 1901. Some comparisons between the two: Exodus 21:26, if a man strikes the eye of his male or female slave and destroys it, he shall let him go free on account of his eye, is the same as the law in 196, if a man puts out the eye of another man, his eye shall be put out. Generally, it can be said that the if-then structure is kept very well between the two documents. Of course, each of them has some exceptions. I mean, I know there's some exceptions in the Hebrew. I'm not 100% sure. Notably, the exceptions in the Hebrew are participles instead of key eam clauses. Another comparison, punishment for kidnapping. If someone kidnaps a man in the Old Testament, he shall be put to death. Same thing with Hammurabi, law number 14. Differences, however. In the covenant, the death penalty was not to be used for theft of items. However, in the Code of Hammurabi, specifically laws 21 and 22, it does prescribe the death penalty for robbery. If anyone breaks into a house, he shall be put to death, and if anyone is caught committing a robbery, then he shall be put to death. These are just 2 smaller examples of a bigger idea about law from this time period called cuneiform law. If you remember, cuneiform, I believe, was the type of writing that all these different cultures had. The Book of the Covenant and Hammurabi's Code were not the only 2 examples of casuistic law from this period, and examples have been found going all the way back to 2350 BC. A quick timeline. 2350 BC, we have not actually found evidence of this, but through other sources they talk about the reforms of Urukagina of Lagash. In 2060 you have the Code of Ur-Nammu, which we have some fragments that have been translated, I believe. Somewhere between 1934 and 1924 BC, there's the Code of Lipit Ishtar of Isin. This, like it says, has a typical epilogue and prologue. In 1800 BC of Ashuna, 1758, again, the Hammurabi and the Assyrian law around the same time as the Hebrews. Real quick, the results: this type of law and structure found in the Book of the Covenant has many precedents in the ancient world. If we take Kitchen's analysis of dating the Exodus to about the 13th century, that leaves the Book of the Covenant to be a much later legal code compared to earlier known examples. And compared to other legal codes, the exact structure of the laws are not as important as the linguistic markers for determining how to read the codes. The structures of society in the Book of the Covenant are very similar to those in the other codes regarding slavery, women, and which property is held in highest importance. But there's a slight tiering difference between the Code of Hammurabi has a 3-tiered system as opposed to the Hebrews. So that's it.